Hi everyone, it's Sunday night and as usual I am here to just reconnect with you and to give you a little bit of feedback on the responses that you gave to me last week and to talk a little bit about the work that we're about to undertake this week. We are entering week 5 of the semester, which seems really quite unbelievable to me, because at the end of this week we will have completed 1/3 of the term. Time passes very quickly, and sooner rather than later, it will be time to really get down to work on your final creative research projects. So far, we have read the Epic of Gilgamesh, we've read several books from the Old Testament, and we're right in the middle of Homer's Odyssey. And in the weeks to come, we'll be turning to ancient Greek drama, to a wonderful ancient Japanese work called The Pillow Book, and in the end of the class, to Shakespeare's late tragedy, King Lear. So a little bit of where we've been and where we're going, and hopefully that sense of where we've been and where we're going will start to get you thinking about where you would like to really begin your research, whether it's with one of the works that we've already talked about, or whether that work is still in the offing someplace in the future of our reading. So, back to the work of this week. This week we will be focusing on the very middle of the Odyssey, on books 9 through 12. And concurrently, we're returning to the issue, the problem, we might say beautiful problem of translation. And so to this end, you will find some materials on the module for this week on our Moodle site that direct you to different translations of particular passages from the Odyssey. And so while, of course, we're all going to be reading books 9 through 12 of the Odyssey, and while you're all responsible for the accompanying lecture materials, you do have a choice when it comes to this week's writing assignment. You're welcome, of course, to write about books 9 through 12, or one of those books, but you're also welcome, if you prefer, to reflect on 3 different translations of the same passage from the Odyssey. If you wish to do the first, right, since we're thinking about books 9 through 12, let me give you a little bit of an overview of those works. This may be the favorite part, or your favorite part of the poem. It is certainly the part of the poem that will be best known to you, so that even if you have never read the Odyssey before, many of the stories that you encounter in books 9 through 12 will be familiar, because they come from the realm of mythology, and you'll recognize them. I bet you've recognized many already. So once we get into books 9 through 12, those books are called the Exotica, right? Just like we have books 1 through 4 being the Telemachy, and 5 through 8, the Homecoming, we have books 9 through 12, the Exotica. And as we move into that space, right, that textual space, if we're thinking of that textual space as a kind of map, we're going way off the official map of the world, and we're really off the grid, right? We're moving into what Shakespeare would have called the green world, and what we can call, right, the mythological world, a place of fantastic adventures. So first of all, I want to think a little bit about the structure of books 9 through 12, because each one shares a very similar pattern. Each of the 3 books presents 3 adventures. So you're going to find 3 adventures in each one. The first 2 are narrated very briefly, and so if you're not paying close attention, you might miss one of those and just find yourself in the middle of the third story, which is going to be narrated at greater length. The books, though, are also related by a series of repeating themes. The most obvious motif in books 9 through 12 is the motif of cannibalism. The second motif, and I think perhaps at least as interesting and maybe much more interesting, is the motif of what the Greeks would have called nostos, right, or of forgetfulness of home, right? This what is home, right? We talked a lot about what that means in the Odyssey, but now this fear, right, that there's a fear of cannibalism, right, of literally having the body consumed by another. But there's another fear, right, and that is the fear that one will forget the meaning of home, and with forgetting the meaning of home, forget also the desire to return home. And the third motif is a motif that runs all the way through the poem, and that motif is the motif of the destructiveness of greed, right, the folly of greed. I should have said, right, when we think about the books 9 through 12, that it's really books 9, 10, and 12 that follow this pattern. Book 11 has a bit of a different pattern. Book 11 deals solely with Odysseus's journey into the underworld. And what's so interesting is that in this cluster of books that each one seems to sort of repeat the previous one in structure, that Book 11 doesn't do that. And of course, right, there are good reasons for that. Right? When one goes into the underworld, right, that's the world of death. And death defeats all patterns. So the very patterns that we see operating again and again and again, even in the mythological world, right, those patterns are cut off, they are meaningless, there is no pattern to death. And so we have just one long episode in Book 11 dealing with the underworld. Another way, right, obviously these are structural ways of approaching books 9 through 12. But structure is never completely divorced, right, from content and from meaning. And so the other way, complementary way, that we can approach books 9 through 12 is to think about them poetically, right, to think about them figuratively and poetically. So every time we see Odysseus encounter a monster of some kind, we want to think about what that monster represents psychologically. How do each of those threats manifest as not just a threat to the physical body, right, but much more importantly, a threat to the very notion of identity. Right? So how are the lotus eaters a threat to identity? Right? How is the Cyclops a threat to identity? Think about those mythological threats, those mythological monsters, right, as also projections, right, of psychological threats. They're not only psychological threats, right, about threatening his identity, but they will also prevent him from coming home, right? And home and identity are very, very closely aligned in the Odyssey and in the Homeric world, just generally. Polyphemos, right, Scylla, the sirens, Circe, they pose physical threats, but the greater threat is psychological. They are temptations of the mind, right? And they're those temptations that are beautifully materialized, right, and externalized in the form of monsters, but really they're also inside Odysseus. So I want to just review a few key points in each of the books.